We're going to be going through Jordan Peterson, his 12 Rules for Life series. We've been doing a series on this topic, trying to have a better understanding of it. And really, we've just been evaluating his rules for life and trying to see if the ideas that make up the rules for life actually are biblical. Do they line up with Scripture? Do they support what the Bible teaches? That's kind of the focus that we have been on. Today is rule number 3, make friends with people who want the best for you. Now, I know our second rule was very long. This one's going to be shorter, just because the chapter is shorter. There's a lot less points to make, a lot less fine details to delineate. So I hope you've been finding this series helpful. I sure have, and it's been very enlightening to me. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into rule number 3. Now, rule number 3, make friends with people who want the best for you. Jordan opens with a bit of discussion about his own upbringing, his own past, his whole situation growing up. And he kind of talks about the fact that there wasn't much to do in his small town. A lot of people weren't making much of themselves. You know, there were a few standard things that you did, and that's it. And so he kind of talks about this in depth. And the first thing he begins to notice is that as he grows up, he starts maturing. And as he starts maturing, he begins wanting to learn, improve, develop himself. And he comes to this point where he's very interested in, taking his life essentially to the next step. And he noticed that his friends from his town, his friends with which he was familiar, didn't seem to have similar ambitions. And so that was a struggle for him. It was a struggle because they lacked the ambitions that he had, and he wanted to improve his life, but they didn't really want to, or at least it seemed that they didn't. So that was kind of what he was wrestling with, and that's where he's going to kind of focus now with some of the points he's making. So the first point of the rule that grabbed my attention was here. He starts talking about how this maturity, this growing, this improving, etc., seemed to be exclusive to him, and that nobody else seemed interested in growing, maturing, and improving like he was. He says this: when you move, everything is up in the air, at least for a while. It's stressful, but in the chaos, there are new possibilities. People, including you, can't hem you in with their old notions. You get shaken out of your ruts. You can make new, better ruts with people aiming at better things. I thought this was just natural development. I thought that every person who moved would have and want the same phoenix-like experience. But this wasn't always the case. Again, he begins to share some of his personal experiences. Then he says this: although we had traveled a long distance, we had gone nowhere at all. What he's essentially saying is we were still stuck in our same old ruts. Okay? And so this is the first point that Peterson brings up that I want to wrestle with. This is kind of hard from a Christian perspective, right? Because you want the best from people. You don't want to give up on people. You don't want to just move on from people and leave them hanging. And this is especially true of old families and friends, things like that. So it can be really something that we wrestle with, this idea of wanting to improve, transform, like he describes it, having a phoenix-like experience when nobody else seems interested in doing that. And this is just something that is kind of a natural development that he noticed, and his conclusion is you got to move on. You got to move on from then. You're maturing and growing. They're not. So be it, right? Is this a biblical idea? You just leave people in the dust like this? Do you just let people fall behind? Well, it's at this point that I started thinking about Matthew 10:34. Because here in Matthew 10:34 through 39, Jesus talks about this relationship, but he takes it even a step further. Jesus talks about this relationship, but he doesn't begin just at, a friendship level. He even takes it to the level of family, okay? And what does Jesus say? He says, do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies will be those of his own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So you've got this discussion that Jesus puts out there about how you're meant to relate to your family, especially after you're essentially in a situation of being a Christian, because he talks about being worthy of him or not worthy of him. Are you my disciple or not? And what Jesus is pointing out here is when you begin to follow Christ with your life, sometimes not everybody's going to be on board with that. Sometimes people aren't going to want to follow Christ, or they're not going to want to see you following Christ. They're not going to want to see you going through that transformation. And so I think this is really relevant, this passage, because it relates the same idea that Peterson is relating, but it goes even a step further. It's almost as though Peterson has softened the blow a little bit when he says, hey, sometimes you need to move on from your old friends. They're not undergoing a transformation. You are. Just continue on and do your thing. Peterson actually undersells it because Jesus says the same is true of your own family. And don't we know this to be true? I think all of us have had experiences where we have close family members or friends that we just aren't as close with once we embrace Christ, embrace our faith, and begin to live our life after the pattern of him. Now, sometimes we do. Sometimes our friends and family members are okay with it. They're open to it. They're excited for you, etc. But that's not always the case. And so there's conflict. And Jesus says when there's a conflict between me and even members of your own family, you're going to follow me. So I think that's super relevant. And I think it is pretty in line with what Peterson is talking about here in rule number 3. This is the case even for non-religious situations. I think all of us have experienced getting into a hobby or being passionate about a certain band or being passionate about a certain thing, right? And you buy tickets to the concert and you're like, hey, will you go with me? Will you go with me? And your friend or family member's like, I don't really like them very much, or you're super interested in hiking and your friend, your fiance, whoever, they're a bookworm and they rarely want to get outdoors. They rarely want to go hiking. All of these are related, okay? We constantly struggle with aligning ourselves properly and appropriately with people who view the world differently than us. But when it comes to Christ, this is taken even a step further. It's not just that we're meant to cloister up in our own little bubble with people who share the same interests as us, but instead Jesus says, you're here to follow me. That's your primary goal. That's your primary motive. Everything else is secondary. And that's a strong claim. It's a powerful claim, but it's what Christ teaches. There was another verse that this idea of leaving behind those who aren't willing to grow reminded me of, and that's 2 Corinthians 6, verses 14 through 18. It says this, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are all the temple of the living God. As God said, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore, go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing, and then I will welcome you. And I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty. So you can see, again, here, a very important point. You're aligning yourself with God. You're aligning yourself with his principles, with his people, with his ideals. And the point being that when you align yourself with God, not everybody else is going to be on board with that. Not everybody else is cool with that. Not everybody feels comfortable with that, okay? And not only that, sometimes people will diametrically oppose that movement. They'll say, no, I don't want to go that direction. I don't want to follow that path. I don't want to follow that route. Or they'll try to lead you down a path of unrighteousness or darkness because that's their lifestyle. That's how they live. That's what they're interested in. And so here's another example that in a very real sense, sometimes we have to leave behind those who aren't willing to grow. And this is, I think, even especially true when it comes to the Christian faith. So frankly, I think Jordan undersells it. And I think the scriptural admonition is even stronger than what Jordan says. And so for that, I've got to give him an A+ on this one. Leave behind those who aren't willing to grow. I've got to give him an A+ on that one because I even think he undersells it a little bit. The fact of the matter is we are God's people. We are meant to follow him, to follow the pattern of his Son, to walk in righteousness, and to love the Lord our God with all heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbors as ourselves. And if we are constantly aligning ourselves with people who don't have those same life interests in mind, it is going to be at odds with our lifestyle. This doesn't mean you can't have non-Christian friends. This doesn't mean you can't talk to people or hang out with people or anything like that. But the fact of the matter is, the most fundamental, closest friendships and relationships you have in your life ought to be with people who share similar interests as you. And I don't just mean hobbies, I mean worldview. They want the best for you. They want these things for you, and they want these things for themselves. So A+ on that one. The second point that jumped out to me is when he starts talking about not everyone who is hurting needs or wants help, okay? He goes into this in another part of the book. Very, very interesting idea. It says this: imagine someone not doing well. He needs help. He might even want it. But it is not easy to distinguish between someone truly wanting and needing help and someone who is merely exploiting a willing helper. The distinction is difficult even for the person who is wanting and needing and possibly exploiting. The person who tries and fails and is forgiven, and then tries again and fails and is forgiven, is also too often the person who wants everyone to believe in the authenticity of all that trying. What this reminded me, guys, of is codependency, okay? I don't know if you guys know about codependency, but codependency is a social, almost disorder, where two people are mutually feeding into one another's negative or bad behavior. Okay. And one of the responsibilities of the people, one of the persons in the codependent cycle, is that they need to be needed by the other person. So a stereotypical example, you might have a husband who's an alcoholic. Okay. And the wife enables him in his alcoholism. Why? Because the wife likes being needed by the husband. So do you see how that works? It's a positive feedback loop, but it's actually a bit of a positive feedback figure eight because you have two people involved, okay? The husband's alcoholic behavior feeds into his wife's behavior of wanting or needing to be needed. And so she's needed because he's an alcoholic, and so she gets fulfillment from being needed, and then he needs or relies upon her to help him with his alcoholism. And you just get this positive feedback loop that functions in a figure eight manner. That's kind of what he's talking about here, right? Especially when he says right here, the person who tries and fails and is forgiven and tries again and fails is forgiven is also too often the person who wants everyone to believe in the authenticity of all that trying. They get something out of helping others. They get something out of doing good for others, okay? And this negative cycle causes them to do damage to the other person and do damage to themselves, okay? And I actually think this issue is biblical as well, but it's kind of subtle. Look with me at Galatians 6, 1-5. It's a very interesting passage. Let's see what this has to say. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you be too tempted. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. There it is. You're supposed to help others, right? Bear their burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor. For we will all have to bear his own load. Wait a second. Verse 5 says you'll all have to bear your own load. Verse 2 says bear one another's burdens. Is there a contradiction here? No, not at all. This is one of the deep wisdom truths of the scriptures. Oftentimes, when you get two ideas that are so close to each other and they seem to contradict, there's a deep truth or wisdom involved in that statement. And here's the idea. If somebody is carrying a load that is too heavy for them, help them to bear it. However, if somebody is refusing to carry a load that is not too heavy for them, but they just don't want to carry it, then you should not help them. You are enabling them, okay? For each will have to bear his own load. The facts are that we're each meant to bear our own load. Now, sometimes that will be too heavy for us. We're meant to help one another. But some people will try not to bear any load whatsoever because they don't feel a need to do that. And if you bear their load for them, you are enabling them. Okay? I often talk about this with drug addiction. There might be a situation where somebody is addicted to a certain drug, and they're unable to go get that drug. And so they try to leverage a family member to go get that drug for them. Hey, go down and see my buddy and give him a 20 and he'll give you, a baggie for me. Well, if you do that, you are enabling them, right? You are allowing them to participate in damaging behavior that is hurting them and drawing them further and further away from God. You're actually not helping them to get better. You're helping them to get worse, okay? And so this type of enabling activity is something that is very damaging, but a lot of people participate in this. And again, it ties right into codependency, okay? And you can see the same idea here in Galatians. For some people, they need to bear their own load, and you need to show them how, help them, aid them, guide them in bearing their own load, right? But for other people, you're going to have to step in and help them bear their burdens, and that will help to fulfill the law of Christ. When do you do which? Well, that's when it comes down to wisdom, okay? I love this passage in Proverbs 26, 4-5. I often quote this when it comes to apologetics because in a conversation with an unbeliever, oftentimes you'll need to understand how to utilize these principles, but it's the same idea for, well, how do I know if I'm enabling them? How do I know if I'm being codependent? Or how do I know if I'm truly helping, right? Well, what does Proverbs 26, 4 and 5 say? Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Two verses back to back. One says, do not answer a fool. The other says, answer a fool. What's the point? The point is this. It takes wisdom to know when to answer the fool, and it takes wisdom to know when to not answer the fool, okay? You have to be wise so that you know when to do each one. Not everyone who is hurting needs help, okay? Or at least help in the way you can give it. You need to recognize that sometimes people don't want help, aren't looking for help. They're going to manipulate and deceive you and take advantage of you, or you are using an enabling tactic, which isn't healthy. And I love Galatians 6, 1-5 and Proverbs 26, 4-5, kind of as a follow-up on this. We all know this verse, but I think it's relevant at this point. Jesus says, don't cast your pearls before swine, right? Do not give to dogs what is holy. Do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample you underfoot and turn to attack you, okay? You have to have the wisdom to know when this person needs help and if you're really helping them, okay? At some point, you're not helping them. This often happens too in behaviors where somebody has set up somebody else kind of as their Messiah. I don't know if you've ever interacted with somebody who was like this, but they essentially looked to you as their Messiah, their Savior. Oh, I love you so much. You're so great. You're so helpful. And they start contacting you and more. They call you more and more. They text you more and more. They need you so much. They've continuously set you up and exalted you in their life, and they've put you in a weird situation because if you let them down, you're just another person in the long string of people who have let them down. And now they hate you, they hate God, etc. But if you allow them to persist in this obsession over you, you are actually not helping them, you're enabling them, okay? Don't give to dogs what is holy. Do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample you underfoot and turn to attack you. This sort of behavior happens a lot out there, and you've got to be aware of it, okay? And so I don't think we're just tapping into psychology when we are utilizing these ideas of trying to have wisdom with who you're going to help and how you're going to help them. I think there are plenty of biblical principles that teach on this. Galatians 6, Proverbs 26, Matthew 7. So on this topic that Jordan Peterson talks about, where he says, it isn't always easy to distinguish between someone truly wanting and needing help and someone who is merely exploiting a willing helper. I've got to give him an A. I've got to give him an A. I think it lines up perfectly with those biblical truths we just talked about. You need to exercise wisdom. And that's essentially what he's saying here. Hey, you need to be careful about which relationships you're going to persist in because some of them are not going to be profitable for you. Some of them will, some of them won't. You need to be careful about them. And I think that's what he's pointing out here. And that's why I got to give him an A on this topic. Okay. Very important idea. Oh, just one final point on helping people. He says this, I thought this was helpful. Rogers believed it was impossible to convince someone to change for the better. The desire to improve was instead a precondition for progress. I've had court-mandated psychotherapy clients. They did not want my help. They were forced to seek it. It did not work. It was a travesty. Look at that, guys. Don't cast your pearls before swine. That's what he's saying. Don't cast your pearls before swine. If people don't have a desire to improve, they won't improve. It is a precondition for progress. You can't make any progress with somebody who doesn't want help, okay? They did not want my help. They were forced to seek it. It did not work. It was a travesty. And that's exactly the sort of thing that Jesus is talking about when he says, don't cast your pearls before swine. Very important idea. Here is the third point that I wanted to bring out. I thought this was very, very interesting, okay? And the point I've defined here is your righteousness reveals other people's inadequacy. Listen to what he has to say. Here's something to consider. If you have a friend whose friendship you wouldn't recommend to your sister or your father or your son, why would you have such a friendship yourself? You might say out of loyalty. Well, loyalty is not identical to stupidity. Loyalty must be negotiated fairly and honestly. Friendship is a reciprocal arrangement. That means two-way street, guys. You are not morally obliged to support someone who is making the world a worse place. Quite the opposite. You should choose people who want things to be better, not worse. It's a good thing, not a selfish thing, to choose people who are good for you. Do you hear that? To get rid of friendships that are damaging to you is not selfish, he says. It's actually a moral good. To seek out relationships that help you to improve and help to improve the world and help to improve others is a good thing. It's not being selfish. Okay? I think that's a key idea. It's a good thing, not a selfish thing, to choose people who are good for you. It's appropriate and praiseworthy to associate with people whose lives would be improved if they saw your life improve. I think that's very powerful, guys. And oftentimes we think we're selfish when we're getting rid of bad relationships. We think we're just being selfish. And so many people won't get rid of the bad relationships because they don't want to be selfish. We're supposed to be sacrificial after all. We're supposed to die to self, right? Yes, but if this person is not seeking out to grow, improve, develop, etc., and they don't want to improve, just like he talks about here, they lack the precondition for progress. And if you can't make progress with them, then they are invariably going to drag you down. He follows this up with another idea that I thought was very, very interesting. He says they will override your accomplishment with past action, real or imaginary, of their own. Maybe they are trying to test you to see if your resolve is real, to see if you're genuine. But mostly they are dragging you down because your new improvements cast their faults in an even dimmer light. When you dare aspire upward, you reveal the inadequacy of the present and the promise of the future. I think this is so powerful, guys. If you're trying to improve, to develop, if you're seeking transformation in Christ, if you're seeking to live your life for the truth after the pattern that God has given us in his Son, and somebody else comes along and begins to drag you down, oftentimes it's because your lifestyle is convicting them. What you are doing, how you are living your life, is actually convicting their heart and soul because you're revealing their inadequacy. And they don't like to feel inadequate. And so they're going to attack you and peck at you and chip away at you and snipe you because you are causing them to feel inadequate. And the fact of the matter is that this relationship is one that is not positive towards God, towards the truth. Instead, it is dragging you down. It is pulling you away from God. It is holding you back from your potential. And you holding on to this relationship is not being sacrificial in a Christ-like manner. It's actually not selfish to abandon them. You should abandon them. That isn't selfish. That is a moral good. It's praiseworthy. It's appropriate. It's a moral ought. Okay? Very, very powerful truth there. Now, is this idea biblical? Is this idea biblical that Peterson is bringing up here? I think so. And I get the same ideas from 1 Peter 4, 3-5. 1 Peter 4, 3-5 says this. Listen to this. Peter says, "For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you." They're living their life in this flood of debauchery, says Peter, and they're surprised when you don't join them, and they malign you. Why? Because, just as Peterson says, when you dare to aspire upwards, you reveal the inadequacy of the present and the promise of the future. They're dragging you down because your new improvements cast their faults in a dimmer light. That's exactly what's going on here in 1 Peter 4:4. What does Peter say? "But they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead." That's the response that we as Christians ought to have. We ought to recognize, okay, sometimes we are going to get criticized for our faith, and oftentimes it's because our trying to live righteously, our aspiring upward, our desire to grow and to improve, our phoenix-like transformation casts their inadequacies in a negative light. They don't like it, they don't appreciate it, and they're going to chip away at you and try to drag you down with them. And the proper thing for you to do, according to Peterson, is to leave those behind. So, this concept that your righteousness reveals their inadequacy, I got to give an A+. I got to give an A+ to Peterson on this one. He nailed it. I think this is exactly, perfectly in line with biblical truth, and it's perfectly in line with what Peter says in 1 Peter 4. Okay? Now, we've gone through all of the quotes in the chapter I wanted to go through. Okay? So all the quotes are done. So, I just want to wrap up briefly with this idea. Again, the rule as a whole is make friends with people who want the best for you. Well, when you think about that and you take it out of the framework of friendship and you put it instead in the framework of community, I see this as a directly biblical concept, right? Build a community with those who want the best for you. That sounds like church to me, guys. Hebrews 10:24. "Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works." And of course, Hebrews also says to not neglect the gathering together of the brethren. This is something we're supposed to do. We're supposed to build community together, to spur one another along, to help each other, to encourage one another. This looks exactly like making friends with people who want the best for you. This is the communities that we're building. This is the point of church. This is the point of the community of Christianity. This is the point of fellowship. This is why you go to Bible study. This is why you go to church potlucks. On and on and on it goes. Because you are making friends with people who want the best for you. I don't know if you've heard of the Inklings before. I love the Inklings. The Inklings were a group of men. The two most famous Inklings are C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, but there are many others, William Barclay and others. And I love the framework of the Inklings because this was a social club where they would get together weekly and they would talk about story and narrative and philosophy, and they would just constantly be incorporating with one another, helping each other, guiding them, directing them, etc. And it's no wonder some of our greatest modern fiction came from two men who were members of the Inklings. Why? Because they made friends with people who wanted the best for them. They built communities around like-minded individuals who were willing to go through a transformation, who were willing to challenge each other, who were willing to love each other and tell each other the hard truths. What is the final analysis of this? We need this today, guys. Badly. We badly need this today. Here in our modern society, we're so fractured, we're so individualistic, we all do our own things, we rarely lean into and rely upon others, and we constantly treat interactions with other human beings in not a reciprocal way. Note that Peterson talked about that in that chapter. He said it was a two-way street, right? It was reciprocal, but we treat our interactions with human beings not in a reciprocal way, but instead in a consumer sort of way. I show up to this place or I engage with you so as to get what I want or need out of you, and then I'm done with you and I move on to something else. I think this rule is so important for our current day and age, our current society. So I think this rule is important. I think it's very powerful. I love all of the little interactions that he gave regarding it. Leave behind those who aren't willing to grow with you. Not everyone who is hurting needs help, and your righteousness reveals other people's inadequacy. Lean into community, lean into strong, real friendships, build communities, and lean into your church, right? Final analysis, what grade do I give Jordan Peterson on rule number 3? It's got to be an A+. It's got to be an A+. The chapter was spot on, and it said many of these biblical truths in a way that modern hearers and modern ears can understand. So A+ for me on rule number 3. I don't know if you guys remember the previous rules and the grades we gave, but so far, Jordan Peterson is faring very, very well, okay? And we're 3 rules into the 12 rules for life, and then we're going to do Beyond Order after that. So hopefully we'll have 24 videos, 24 rules analyzed by the end of it. But so far, he's faring very well. And here's something I want to say. God is doing something right now in our society and culture. There are a lot of people who are interested in Jordan Peterson, and not just Jordan Peterson, but the ideas surrounding the man. And I think as we analyze the rules, we can see there is so much biblical truth in what he is saying. And he has a great audience. We should be praying, but we should also be looking for which way the wind is blowing, i.e. how the Spirit is moving in our current society and culture. And also, if you have a family member or a friend who you've been trying to evangelize or witness to try and help them and give them direction and guidance, I feel like you could do a lot worse than getting them a copy of 12 Rules for Life. Maybe they wouldn't be open to reading a Bible. Maybe they wouldn't be open to reading C.S. Lewis, but they might be open to reading Jordan Peterson. And so far as I can tell, there's a lot of good biblical truth in what we've seen thus far. We still have 9 rules to go in the first book, and then another 12 rules after that, so we still have plenty of time to critique him, but we found a lot of good stuff so far. And so that's my review of rule number 3. I hope that was helpful.